Time for Tonight in History Spotlight. You won't want to miss it next. Tonight's historical spotlight shines on Cyrus the Great. The Persian conqueror ruled the Achaemenid dynasty, living between the years 590 and 529 BC. Not only was Cyrus the Great a brilliant military strategist who conquered lands surrounding Mesopotamia, he was unusually tolerant for the times as well. In fact, when the Persians invaded Babylon in 539 BC, the city's residents opened the gates to Cyrus the Great because they were frustrated with their local rulers and had heard stories of King Cyrus being lenient to his conquered peoples. These stories from the Persian ruler's life even managed to make an appearance in Jewish scripture after King Cyrus freed the captive Jews of Babylon, allowing them to return from their exile back to Jerusalem and to begin work on rebuilding their temple there. After capturing Babylon, King Cyrus commissioned a cylinder covered in cuneiform inscriptions to be made, which some today argue was the first declaration of human rights. A replica of the Cyrus cylinder is currently on display at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. But that isn't the only lasting influence that King Cyrus has had on America. One of our most important founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, also looked to King Cyrus for inspiration on how to enshrine religious tolerance into our laws. For more on that connection, I want to welcome on my last guest tonight, documentary and filmmaker Cyrus Carr of Spenta Productions. Thanks for being here tonight, Cyrus.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So you've traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, putting together the pieces of King Cyrus's life for your documentary. So before we get into the connection with Thomas Jefferson, tell me about some of your adventures.
Well, we traveled, we literally followed in his footsteps. We traced his footsteps as best we could based on scholarly exploration and research, and so we had a lot of help from scholars that told us exactly, the chronology and the destinations, which route we should take, and so it was quite an adventure. It took us from Tajikistan to Uzbekistan to Afghanistan to Iran to Iraq, Turkey, and that's about it. I mean, but then we traveled a lot of other places just to interview the scholars.
That is really exciting stuff. You're really living the dream for many of the history buffs, such as myself and those who may be watching from home saying, I wish I could travel the world in one of my heroes' footsteps as well. So I know a lot of people, they probably want to know now, what's the connection between Cyrus the Great and Thomas Jefferson? What influence did this Persian ruler have on someone who would live over 2,600 years after his own death?
Right. That's a really good question. And it wasn't just Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is the only founder whose copies of the Cyropaedia we were able to find at the Library of Congress. But there were many others dating to the same time as Thomas Jefferson. We believe they just were anonymous. But we know that James Madison, Ben Franklin, were all very heavy readers of Xenophon's Cyropaedia. And the connection is really, if you think about it, America, the United States, is about the only democracy that has an executive branch of government. And an executive branch of government is not an organic or natural extension or outgrowth of a democracy. In fact, it's antithetical to a democracy. So how did they come up with this concept of an executive branch or a president, which is equivalent really to a monarch, if but for 4 years? A natural extension or natural outgrowth of a democracy would be a prime minister who's the leader of the majority. But the founders were fixated on protecting the minority from the tyranny of the majority, as John Adams called it. And because they read the ancient, they read a lot about the democracy of ancient Athens, Greece, where they put so many innocent people to death just by the whims of a mob. So James Madison, literally in the Federalist Papers, says that if every Athenian were Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still be a mob. And and the reason he uses Socrates is because Socrates was sentenced to death by the majority, by the whims of this mob. And so they knew that they needed something to protect the minorities. And throughout history, if you look back through history, what the regimes or the forms of government that have most protected minority rights have been monarchies. And because monarchs often rise up from minority groups themselves. So you can see this all over the Middle East, like Bashar al-Assad. He's an Alawite, a minority group who rules over, and he protects the Christians and the minority groups there better than any democracy, which would obliterate them, as we saw what happened in Iraq when democracy was introduced and the Christians were fleeing. So what gave them the idea for an executive branch? It could have only been Cyrus the Great, because he was studied both through, the founders were in Xenophon's Cyropaedia was almost required reading for them, including John Locke, who was a great, reader and influencer of the founders. And so, and then they were also familiar with the Old Testament. And so they understood this. And so they have the executive branch to guard against the tyranny of the majority of the legislative branch.
Cyrus, thank you so much for dropping by tonight and sharing some of your expertise with us on this matter. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And with that, I'm all out of time for tonight. Hopefully you learned something interesting to take with you into tomorrow.